I had never given much thought to the quietness of my building. It was just something that came with the territory, an unspoken understanding that my home was meant for peaceful solitude. My apartment had been my refuge, a place where the outside world felt miles away. My routine was simple. I'd come home, unwind, and enjoy the stillness that surrounded me. But one night, that comfort was disrupted. It started with an odd scraping sound, faint but unmistakable, piercing through the walls as if someone were dragging something heavy. I dismissed it at first, attributing it to a clumsy tenant moving furniture. But the noise continued, long after midnight, rhythmic and unsettling. As I lay in bed, each scrape seemed to grow louder, closer. I tried to ignore it, willing myself to sleep, but the sound burrowed into my mind, a slow, steady intrusion into my peace. The quiet that I once took for granted had been broken, and in its place, there was an insidious echo of something I couldn't quite identify. I told myself it was nothing, a momentary disturbance, but a sliver of doubt settled in, making me wonder if there was more to it than a simple noise. Sleep finally came, but not without a sense of unease that lingered long into the next day. The following night, the noises returned, louder and more insistent. The scraping was joined by a series of muffled bangs, as though someone were slamming something against the wall. It became impossible to ignore. I found myself lying in bed, listening intently, every nerve on edge as the sounds reverberated through my apartment. They seemed to pulse with an almost human intensity, an anger or frustration that I couldn't understand. By the third night, my frustration had given way to something closer to fear. The noises had become a nightly ritual, a relentless assault on my senses that left me exhausted and on edge. I tried listening closely, hoping to make sense of it, but the sounds only grew stranger, more deliberate, as if something or someone was trying to communicate. The worst part was that the noises seemed to be coming from directly behind my bedroom wall, creeping closer with each passing night. I found myself caught in a cycle of anxious listening, unable to sleep, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. The peace I once cherished had been replaced by an invisible threat, lurking just beyond the wall, taunting me with each scrape and bang. After nearly a week of sleepless nights, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. The next day, I waited for a chance to confront my neighbor. I barely knew the man who lived next door, having only exchanged a few polite nods in the hallway. But that night, I went straight to his door and knocked, waiting with my heart pounding as I heard his footsteps approach. When he opened the door, his face registered a brief look of surprise before settling into an unreadable expression. I tried to keep my voice steady as I explained the noises, describing how they kept me up every night. He listened in silence, avoiding my gaze, offering only vague nods and dismissive replies. When I pressed him for an explanation, he simply shrugged, brushing off my concerns with a muttered excuse about renovations. But his avoidance, his refusal to look me in the eye, felt like a confirmation of something far darker. I walked away from his door with a heavy sense of dread, my questions only multiplying. Whatever was happening on the other side of that wall, I was certain now that it wasn't anything as simple as renovations. The following evening, as I returned home, I saw my neighbor leaving the building. I hadn't planned on doing anything reckless, but the sight of him walking away stirred something inside me, a desperate need to know what was going on behind that wall. Before I could think it through, I found myself walking toward his apartment, my pulse quickening as I reached for the doorknob. To my surprise, it turned easily. The door was unlocked. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but a stronger urge propelled me forward. The apartment was dark and eerily silent, the only sound the faint echo of my own footsteps. I moved cautiously, every creak of the floorboards sending a shiver down my spine. As I ventured deeper into the apartment, I heard it, the familiar scraping and banging, louder and more intense, coming from a room at the end of the hallway. The noise grew louder as I approached the door, filling the silence with an almost palpable tension. I stopped just outside, my hand hovering over the doorknob, unsure if I could go through with it, but the curiosity, the need to know, was stronger than my fear. I opened the door slowly, my breath hitching as I prepared myself for what lay beyond. Stepping inside, I found myself in a dimly lit room with sparse furniture, and an air of neglect that hung heavy in the stale air. The noises, the scraping, the desperate banging, were coming from behind yet another door on the far wall, this one securely locked. I could feel my pulse thundering in my ears as I moved closer, the sounds now deafening, pulsing with an urgency that sent chills down my spine. My eyes darted around the room, searching for anything that could give me access to the locked door. I spotted a key, resting almost nonchalantly on top of the fridge, as if it had been carelessly left there. My hands trembled as I picked it up, the weight of what I was about to do pressing down on me. I felt a jolt of dread, but curiosity had a firm grip on me now, refusing to let go. With a deep breath, I inserted the key into the lock. The click sounded impossibly loud in the quiet room, and for a moment I hesitated, every fiber of my being screaming for me to stop. But I twisted the handle and pushed the door open, bracing myself for whatever lay on the other side. The sight that met my eyes was one I'd never be able to forget. In the dim, suffocating space behind the door, a woman sat huddled on the floor, her body slumped, her gaze vacant and hollow. She looked as if she hadn't seen daylight in days, her clothes disheveled and her skin marked with grime and exhaustion. The room was small, stifling, and barren, save for a thin mattress and a bucket in the corner, a crude and disturbing setup. The woman raised her head slightly when she saw me, her eyes filled with a strange mixture of hope and fear. She didn't say anything, but the desperation in her expression was enough. I realized in that moment the horrific truth of what had been happening just a wall away from where I slept. This wasn't some harmless disturbance. This was a nightmare unfolding in the apartment next door. I stammered, trying to find words, but nothing came. The woman's silent gaze was enough to paralyze me. I wanted to help her, to get her out of this hellish place, but I didn't know how. We shared a moment of silence, an understanding that we were both trapped, albeit in different ways. Finally, I gestured for her to follow, and she nodded, her movements slow and uncertain as she rose from the floor. We were nearly at the door, the apartment's hallway looming ahead like a path to freedom, when the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed from the entrance. My heart sank. I froze, and the woman's face twisted with panic as we heard the door click open, the heavy footsteps of the neighbor reverberating through the apartment. We scrambled back into the small room, and I turned the key in the lock, praying that it would hold. My mind raced as the neighbor's footsteps drew closer, the sound of his angry muttering sending waves of terror through me. I took out my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed 911. I kept my voice low, whispering my address and explaining the situation as best I could. The dispatcher's calm response did little to ease the dread building inside me, but I held on to the hope that help was on its way. Outside the door, the neighbor was growing frantic. He banged on the door, his fists slamming against the wood, each hit reverberating through the small space. I held my breath, the woman clutching her knees as we both waited, trapped in a silence filled with fear. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I heard the sound of heavy footsteps in the corridor outside. The police had arrived. The knocking stopped abruptly, and I could hear the neighbor's voice, now laden with fear, as he argued with the policeman. Then there was a loud scuffle. The sounds of resistance were answered with firm commands, and then the apartment fell silent. Moments later, I opened the door and a policeman came to us. He helped us up, guiding us out of the cramped room and into the corridor, where other policemen had already subdued the neighbor, his hands cuffed behind his back. The woman clung to me as we gave evidence, her relief palpable, but overshadowed by a persistent fear. As I watched the police take my neighbor away, a feeling of deep unease came over me. I couldn't comprehend the horror that lurked beyond my walls, a nightmare hidden in plain sight. I didn't think much of it at first. A plain brown box sat on my doorstep when I returned from work, nothing particularly unusual except for the name on the label. R. Coleman. Not mine. The rational part of me thought to leave it for the mail carrier or return it to the post office, but curiosity had already taken hold. Why not take a peek, I reasoned. Maybe I could find out something about this Coleman, whoever they were. Inside, I found items carefully wrapped in tissue paper, as if each piece held significance to someone. The first item was a small notebook, its cover worn, edges frayed. I flipped it open, expecting maybe grocery lists or mundane notes. But the pages held something far stranger. Haphazard sketches filled the margins, frantic scrawls in looping handwriting that twisted and turned into symbols I didn't recognize. Words leaped out at me. Surveillance, trust no one, they are close. A chill pricked my skin, the unease creeping deeper as I read on. Whatever thoughts Coleman had poured into these pages felt urgent and unhinged, bordering on obsession. And then, I found the photographs. Each image was faded and grainy, but unmistakably familiar. Places I knew well, an alleyway near my building, the corner store I frequented, and most unsettling of all, the view from my own window. My fingers trembled as I thumbed through each one, realizing that they'd been taken from vantage points near my apartment. Coleman hadn't just documented the neighborhood, they'd been watching, and now so was I. I stared down at the box, the photographs scattered around me, feeling a strange sense of violation. I'd moved into this apartment for its sense of security, for the quiet anonymity of city life. But with every strange item I found, I felt that sense of security slipping away. I'd barely had a moment to process it all when I noticed something tucked under the notebook, a small key, old and slightly tarnished. It looked almost ceremonial, like it was meant for something more than just opening a door. Attached to the key was a note, handwritten in the same erratic scrawl as the notebook's pages. "Keep this with you," it read. "Don't let them in." It was such a bizarre instruction, cryptic yet urgent, and I found myself clutching the key tightly, feeling a strange compulsion to obey, even though I didn't understand why. With each item, I felt more entangled in Coleman's world, an invisible net drawing me into whatever strange paranoid life they'd led. But it wasn't until night fell that I began to feel the weight of that connection. Every creak in the apartment, every muffled noise from the hallway took on new meaning, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder, unable to shake the feeling that I was now part of something I couldn't fully comprehend. I kept the key with me, just as the note instructed. It was irrational, I knew that. This was just an abandoned package, left behind by a former tenant. And yet, the weight of it in my pocket felt oddly reassuring, as though I was following a set of instructions, no matter how strange. Over the next few days, the paranoia started to settle in deeper. The notes, the photographs, the urgent scrawls about surveillance, it all seemed to twist the normalcy of my surroundings into something darker, like a spotlight had been cast on a threat I hadn't noticed before. I tried to brush it off, to convince myself I was reading too much into it. But the sense of being watched clung to me. Each night, I'd lie in bed, listening for sounds I might have otherwise ignored, the occasional clank of pipes, distant footsteps in the hall, the hum of the city beyond my window. Yet now, they felt pointed, deliberate, as though each sound was a reminder that I wasn't alone. I tried asking the building manager about R. Coleman, hoping for an explanation that would ground me, a reason that would banish this absurd sense of paranoia. But the manager just shrugged, saying that Coleman had left suddenly without any notice, taking only a few things and leaving no forwarding address. The vagueness of it all did nothing to reassure me. If anything, it deepened my feeling of dread. The paranoia grew. Each day felt like a slow descent, every noise and shadow feeding into the mounting tension. The photos, those snapshots of the view from my own window, haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was someone out there watching me, just as Coleman had watched before. That night, as I walked into my living room, a slight movement outside caught my attention. I glanced toward the window, expecting to see nothing but empty darkness. But there it was, a faint shadow, shifting just beyond the glass, as if someone was hovering just out of sight. My heart pounded as I strained to see, pressing closer to the window. But when I looked again, the street below was empty. No figure, no movement. Just the quiet, deserted night staring back at me. Yet the sense of eyes watching me lingered, an unshakable presence that stayed with me even after I'd closed the curtains. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had become a part of Coleman's story, somehow bound to this strange, faceless threat. And no matter how irrational it seemed, the warning on the note echoed in my mind. Don't let them in. I couldn't live in that state of constant paranoia. Each time I thought I'd finally dismissed the fear, something pulled me back, a sound or a flicker outside the window, reminding me that I was never truly alone. I needed answers, something solid to explain why this feeling had latched onto me. So I went back to the building manager, hoping he might have more details than he'd shared before. This time, I pressed him harder, pushing past his casual indifference, asking about R. Coleman's behavior before they left. He sighed, almost irritated, as he scratched his head. "Look," he said, shifting uncomfortably. "Coleman was strange, kept to himself, never left much of a trace, just up and vanished one night, took off without any warning." I wanted more, but his tone suggested he'd already told me all he knew. He didn't care about Coleman or the box left behind, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that something wasn't right, that Coleman's sudden departure was more than just a tenant deciding to move. When I returned to my apartment, the shadows felt darker, the air heavier, and I was certain that whatever Coleman had feared was still there, lingering, waiting. And now it seemed I'd taken Coleman's place. The odd occurrences in my apartment escalated, each one a small but distinct disturbance that seemed almost designed to fray my nerves. I'd find objects shifted subtly out of place, as though someone had moved through my home with a barely noticeable touch, leaving behind traces of their presence. My keys would vanish, only to reappear in unlikely spots, or my curtains would be slightly parted, giving me glimpses of the street below, where shadows seemed to gather just out of reach of the streetlights. The notebook from the box became my constant companion, a strange form of solace in its cryptic pages. The scrawled phrases began to feel more like instructions than warnings. Keep them out. They are close. Trust no one. I knew it was irrational, but something in me started to believe the words, as if following them could offer some kind of protection. One evening, as I stood in the darkened kitchen, I caught sight of something unusual through the window. It was a faint glint, barely visible, as though someone was watching me from the shadows outside, reflecting just enough light to make their presence known. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I realized I was no longer simply imagining this presence. It was real, and it was drawing closer. Desperation crept in, urging me to seek out answers wherever I could find them. The old key from the box weighed heavily in my pocket, a constant reminder of the cryptic note. I'd put off trying it anywhere, but now it seemed like my only option. Clutching it, I made my way to the basement, remembering the little-used storage rooms I'd seen when I first moved in. My heart raced as I descended the stairs, the dim lighting casting strange shadows on the walls. At the end of a narrow corridor, I found a small, rusted door. The lock was old, and when I inserted the key, it turned with a grating sound that echoed in the silence. The door creaked open, revealing a cramped storage room filled with scattered items, as if someone had been rifling through it recently. My stomach churned as I stepped inside, the air thick with a musty odor that hinted at years of abandonment. On a makeshift table sat more of Coleman's belongings, a stack of papers covered in paranoid scribbles, a map marked with strange symbols, and an old tape recorder. I pressed play, my pulse quickening as Coleman's voice filled the room, panicked and barely coherent. "They're close, closer than ever," he muttered. "If you're hearing this, keep the key with you. It's the only way to keep them out." His voice trailed off, leaving an oppressive silence that seemed to press down on me, reminding me of the threat that now seemed closer than ever. As I left the storage room, clutching the key tightly, a feeling of dread settled deep within me. I knew now that whatever Coleman had been fleeing was real, that he'd lived in the shadow of this looming presence until he could take no more. And now I had become his unwitting successor, bound to the same haunting paranoia, unable to escape the feeling of eyes watching, tracking my every move. In the hallway outside my apartment, I caught sight of a figure, just a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. But when I turned, there was nothing, only the emptiness of the dim corridor. Yet I could feel it, a presence lingering in the silence, as if someone or something was waiting. That night, I lay awake, clutching the key, Coleman's warning ringing in my mind. Don't let them in. I didn't know who they were or what they wanted, but I understood now that the fear was my own to bear. And as I stared into the darkness, I realized that I had become part of Coleman's story. bound to whatever unknown force he'd tried to escape. The library had always been a sanctuary for me, a place of quiet comfort where the outside world seemed to fade away. The subtle smell of old paper, the whispering shuffles of people wandering through the aisles, the weight of history and knowledge around me, all of it created a space that felt timeless. I visited every week, sometimes more, drawn back by the promise of escape into stories far removed from my own life. It was my small ritual. Settle in a quiet spot, flip through the pages of something new, and let the hours slip by unnoticed. That day, I was thumbing through a mystery novel when something unexpected fell out from between the pages. A small, folded note. I picked it up, feeling a ripple of curiosity as I unfolded the paper. In neat, precise handwriting, someone had left a short message. If you're reading this, I hope you enjoy the book as much as I did. It was simple, friendly, the kind of gesture you might expect from one book lover to another. I smiled, slipping the note back into the pages, amused by the thought of someone leaving little pieces of themselves for others to find. As I continued reading, the note slipped from my mind, just a harmless curiosity that added a small touch of humanity to my day. But as I'd soon discover, it was only the beginning. The following week, I returned to the library, drawn back as always to the quiet refuge I'd come to cherish. I wandered through the aisles, searching for something new, and found myself lost in the pages of a classic novel. But as I flipped through, another folded note slipped out, landing softly on the floor. My heart gave a little jump. Another note? The handwriting was unmistakable, the same neat looping letters as before. "Have you read this author before? A hidden gem," it said. My fingers traced the edges of the paper, a shiver of curiosity running through me. Was it just a coincidence? Or was someone leaving these notes deliberately, meant for whoever happened upon them? I couldn't tell, but the mystery intrigued me, adding a thrill to the familiar comfort of the library. Each visit after that brought a new note, always tucked within the pages of different books, each one written by the same unseen hand. At first, the notes were harmless, full of book recommendations and little musings. It became something I almost looked forward to, a peculiar game that only I seemed to be playing. It was as if some anonymous book lover had decided to share their thoughts with me, weaving their presence into the quiet sanctuary I'd come to love. I never imagined it would go beyond that it would become something far stranger and far more personal. The notes began to change. What once seemed like friendly messages turned into something more unnerving, as though the writer's focus had shifted to me. One note read, "You always sit by the window," a casual observation that sent an uncomfortable prickle down my spine. It felt as if I were being watched, my little rituals studied and recorded by someone I couldn't see. Another note appeared the following week, tucked inside a novel I'd chosen on a whim. "Green is a good color on you," it said. I felt a chill as I read those words, my mind racing through every interaction I'd had in the library, every glance I'd exchanged with the other patrons. Who could be writing these notes, and why were they paying such close attention to me? The harmless fun of finding the notes had shifted to something darker, a silent intrusion that had seeped into the quiet peace I'd once found in the library. The more I thought about it, the more unnerved I became. I told myself it was just a strange coincidence, perhaps an innocent attempt at friendliness that I was blowing out of proportion. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Despite the unease that now clung to my library visits, I continued going, unwilling to give up my sanctuary over a few notes. I tried to brush off the discomfort, telling myself I was overreacting, that these messages couldn't be as personal as they seemed. I even started choosing different spots to sit, moving away from the window in hopes that whoever was writing the notes might lose track of me. But the notes persisted, each one appearing in new books, tucked carefully between pages as if waiting just for me. And then, one day, I found another note that made my heart skip a beat. "You looked worried today? Something wrong?" The words seemed to seep off the page, wrapping around me with a chill that I couldn't shake. The writer had noticed my mood, my attempt to blend in more, to escape their gaze. There was no denying it now. Whoever was leaving these notes knew me, my habits, even my emotions. I left the library that day feeling exposed, the walls of my sanctuary closing in as I realized that what I'd once found comforting had transformed into a place where someone was watching, observing my every move. I went back to the library, but my visits had changed entirely. Now, each step felt calculated, each glance an act of self-defense. My eyes darted around the room, searching for anyone who seemed to be watching too closely. The usual patrons were there, all familiar faces to some degree. Students hunched over textbooks, an elderly woman with her knitting, a few regulars absorbed in their books. No one seemed out of place, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that one of them was observing me, a presence masked by ordinary behavior. I began scanning every aisle, studying the subtle movements of anyone who entered or left. My heart pounded as I caught sight of someone looking up from their book for a fraction of a second, only to return to reading when I glanced their way. Had they been watching me? I couldn't be sure. The line between suspicion and paranoia had started to blur, and the once comforting stillness of the library now felt like a trap, its silence a web waiting to ensnare me. Each glance in turn felt like a small betrayal of the safety I'd once found there. No matter how hard I looked, I couldn't pinpoint anyone. Yet the sense of being watched clung to me like a shadow I couldn't escape. The library was no longer my sanctuary. It was a place filled behind books and quiet whispers. Then came the final note, the one that shattered any last illusion of peace. It was tucked inside a history book I had pulled from the far corner, a place I'd chosen specifically because it was hidden from the usual foot traffic. The note slipped out from between the last few pages, almost as if waiting for me. I unfolded it slowly, my hands trembling as I read the message. "I think it's time we met. Same time tomorrow?" The note was direct, devoid of the subtlety that had marked the earlier messages. There was no hint of warmth or friendliness this time, just a cold certainty that sent a shiver through me. My hands grew clammy as I clutched the note, a creeping realization settling over me. Whoever had been leaving these messages knew my routine, my exact movements. They knew I'd find this note, and now they were expecting me. I left the library in a daze, the note still in my hand, unsure of what to do. My sanctuary, the place I'd once found solace, had turned into a place of quiet dread. My heart pounded with the knowledge that someone, somewhere, was waiting for me to show up the next day. But I couldn't bring myself to go back, couldn't bear the thought of what or who might be waiting for me. Days passed, and I didn't return to the library. I avoided that part of town altogether, staying as far from it as I could, yet the memories of those notes haunted me. I would catch myself thinking of the final message, its casual invitation more chilling with each passing day. Part of me wondered what would have happened if I'd gone back, if I'd faced whoever had been watching me all this time. But the thought left a sick feeling in my stomach, and I quickly pushed it aside. Yet, even away from the library, the sense of being watched persisted. I'd glance over my shoulder on my way to work, feel eyes on me in crowded spaces, hear footsteps that seemed to fall in rhythm with my own. The paranoia had followed me beyond those library walls, embedding itself into my everyday life. What was once a place of comfort and routine was now a ghost that lingered, always a shadow behind me. Moving into a new house should have been exhilarating. The possibilities, the fresh start, it was everything I had been looking forward to. As I pulled up to the house, my heart swelled with a strange mix of excitement and nerves, imagining the memories I would create within those walls. I took a deep breath, savoring the moment, and stepped inside, eager to embrace the change. But as soon as I crossed the threshold, a strange feeling settled over me. The air felt dense, as though I had walked into a room filled with shadows, unseen and oppressive. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just nerves and fatigue. After all, moving was exhausting, and a new house always felt a little foreign at first. But as I unpacked, I couldn't shake the heaviness that seemed to hang in the air, clinging to every room, every corner. The excitement I'd felt earlier dulled, replaced by an unexplainable discomfort. Each box I unpacked, every item I placed, seemed to sink into the house like a stone into water, swallowed by the weight that permeated the space. The thought crossed my mind more than once that maybe I had made a mistake, that perhaps I wasn't meant to live here. But I pushed it aside, determined to make this house my own, no matter how unsettling it felt. Over the following days, I began to notice things that didn't quite make sense. The walls seemed off. Each one seemed to angle just slightly away from the other, as though the house had been built without a ruler or level, creating a subtle disorientation whenever I tried to take in the layout. Even the doors were peculiar. They would stick at odd moments, refusing to open fully as if they had a will of their own. I'd pull with all my strength, only for them to give way suddenly, sending me stumbling into the next room. At first, I tried to laugh it off, thinking that maybe this was just part of the house's charm, but the irregularities were becoming harder to ignore. It felt as though the house itself was resisting me, as if each crooked line and stubborn door was its way of keeping me on the outside, never quite letting me settle in. I began feeling uneasy, a faint doubt creeping in with every door that wouldn't open, every wall that seemed just a little too skewed. These small inconsistencies planted seeds of discomfort, twisting the excitement I had once felt into something darker. The house that was supposed to be my refuge now felt foreign, a place where I was unwelcome. The unsettling feeling only grew as I started to notice changes in the layout. I'd leave a chair in one place and return to find it felt slightly off, as though it had been shifted by an inch or two. The living room, in particular, seemed different every time I entered. I would position the furniture to my liking, only to return later and feel as though the space had shifted subtly, like a room that was never quite the same twice. At first I thought I was imagining it. I'd questioned my own memory, wondering if I'd moved things without realizing it. But the changes were too consistent, too deliberate to ignore. Each day I found myself feeling more disoriented, as though the house itself was alive, shifting around me in a way that defied logic. The changes made me question everything, from where I'd placed my belongings to the stability of my own mind. I tried to convince myself it was just the strain of moving that I was still adjusting. But deep down, a darker thought began to take root, that the house was somehow aware of my presence, subtly altering itself in response to me. It was an unsettling thought, one that lingered like a shadow just out of sight, leaving me with a gnawing sense of dread. By the end of the first week, I could no longer dismiss the feeling that I was being watched. It was a creeping sensation, subtle yet insistent, like a presence lingering in the corners, just out of sight. Shadows clung to the edges of each room, lingering in ways that felt unnatural, as though they were more than just a play of light. At night, the feeling grew stronger, and the silence of the house became oppressive. Every small creak, every whisper of air moving through the hallways sent a chill down my spine. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, irrationally expecting to see someone standing there, watching me. But there was never anyone, only the empty rooms and the echo of my own footsteps. Sleep became difficult. I would lie in bed, straining to hear any sound, any indication that I wasn't alone. The house seemed to breathe, each sound amplified in the silence, feeding my growing paranoia. The realization crept in slowly but surely. I wasn't alone. Whether it was my imagination or something else, I felt certain that something was there with me, something that seemed to inhabit the very walls of the house. One night, I woke suddenly, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what had stirred me, but an uneasy feeling gripped me, as if something was wrong. I lay there for a moment, straining to listen, before deciding to go to the bathroom. As I stepped into the hallway, I felt a chill, a heavy weight in the air that made my skin prickle with fear. Something was different. Halfway down the hallway, I froze. There in the darkness, standing just beyond the reach of the faint light spilling from my bedroom, was a figure. It was indistinct, almost blending into the shadows, but I could see its outline, a silent, unmoving form that seemed to watch me. My breath caught in my throat, my pulse quickening as I realized that whatever I had been sensing all this time wasn't just a feeling, it was real. For a moment, neither of us moved. I stood rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away, my mind racing as I tried to process what I was seeing. The figure remained still, its presence heavy and suffocating, filling the hallway with an oppressive silence. And then, as the terror finally overcame my paralysis, I backed up slowly, retreating into my bedroom, slamming the door shut and locking it with trembling hands. Inside the locked room, I sat on the edge of my bed, too frightened to move, my eyes fixed on the door as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. My heart hammered in my chest, every nerve on edge as I listened intently for any sound from the hallway. But the house was silent, an eerie, unnatural stillness that only heightened my fear. I left the light on, huddling under the covers like a child, waiting for the first rays of dawn to pierce through the windows. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint whisper of air seemed magnified, filling the room with a sense of dread that I couldn't escape. I tried to convince myself it had been a dream, a figment of my imagination, but the memory of that figure, its silent, watchful presence, was seared into my mind. As the hours dragged on, sleep was out of the question. My mind replayed the encounter over and over, each time finding new details that made it all the more real, all the more terrifying. The house, once my fresh start, had become a place of fear, a prison I couldn't bear to remain in. When morning finally came, I felt a rush of relief, the sunlight casting a thin layer of safety over the house. But the sense of dread lingered, a dark shadow that followed me as I moved through each room, packing my things. I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. The night's encounter had shattered any illusion of safety, leaving behind only fear and the unsettling knowledge that I was not alone. I moved quickly, packing hastily, too terrified to linger in any room for long. I could feel the house watching me, its walls pressing in as though it knew I was leaving. I didn't dare to look back down the hallway, didn't risk even a glance toward the spot where I had seen the figure. I just wanted to be out, to leave behind whatever horror had taken residence in the shadows of this place. With each box I carried to the car, the relief grew stronger, the weight lifting ever so slightly. And yet, as I closed the trunk, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching, that some unseen presence was standing in the doorway, waiting for me to return. Driving away, I felt a wave of relief, an almost giddy freedom that filled me as I put distance between myself and that house. I almost didn't see the notification. It was buried among the usual flood of spam and updates from accounts I'd barely used in years. Just another alert from an old email address I hadn't thought about in ages. But the subject line caught my eye. Activity alert, recent login. I stared at it for a moment, my curiosity piqued. Who would be logging into this old account? I barely remembered setting it up, much less using it in any recent memory. Against my better judgment, I clicked. The email displayed a list of recent logins from unfamiliar locations, all within the last few days. My heart skipped a beat as I scanned through the entries, the unsettling realization dawning on me that someone had accessed an account I hadn't touched in years. I couldn't just ignore it. I needed to know what was going on. Without hesitating, I reset the password and logged in, hoping to find a clue, some hint of who might be using it. The inbox was empty, save for a handful of unread notifications and updates. But it was when I checked the drafts folder that I felt the first pang of real fear. There, dozens of saved drafts sat waiting, all addressed to me, written by someone who seemed to know me intimately. My hand hovered over the drafts folder, hesitating, a sense of dread creeping in. But I had to know. I clicked on the first message, my breath catching as I read the words. I saw you at the coffee shop yesterday. You looked distracted. The draft was unsent, the message incomplete, as if the person had stopped midway, unsure of whether to send it or keep it to themselves. I clicked on another. I know you walk home alone most nights. It's not safe. You should be more careful. Each message was written in the same eerily familiar tone, as if the writer knew me personally, knew my habits, my schedule, even my moods. Details that only someone close to me would know were scattered throughout the messages, each draft feeling like a piece of my life laid bare for this stranger to dissect. My fingers trembled as I clicked through draft after draft, each one more disturbing than the last. Whoever had been using this account hadn't just stumbled upon my life. They had been watching, recording, documenting each moment with a level of attention that bordered on obsession. The sense of intrusion, of being invaded in a way I couldn't escape, settled over me like a suffocating weight. The drafts stretched back years, as if someone had been keeping tabs on me for longer than I'd ever realized. Some messages were innocuous, describing events from years past that I barely remembered myself. But as the drafts grew more recent, the tone shifted. They began mentioning places I'd visited just days ago, things I'd done recently, details that sent a chill down my spine. One message in particular made my skin crawl. "Saw you at the park yesterday. You looked worried." I remembered going to the park alone, feeling lost in thought, unaware of anyone around me. But someone had been there, someone who had seen me, studied me, and recorded their observations in this hidden account. Another draft read, "You really should be more careful about who you trust." It was as if the writer knew something I didn't, some secret danger lurking in the shadows of my own life. With each message, the sense of fear deepened, a cold realization that this wasn't just casual curiosity. It was a violation, a watching eye that had been tracking my every move without my knowing. I felt vulnerable, exposed in a way that made my skin crawl. As I continued reading, I noticed that each draft had a timestamp, the dates stretching back years. Whoever had been writing these messages had been following me for a long time, creating a detailed timeline of my life. I tried to think of who might know me well enough to write these messages, but no one came to mind. There was no friend, no family member who would keep tabs on me this way, in secret, for years. The timeline told a story, my story, each draft a chapter in the life I had unknowingly shared with this stranger. They knew my daily routines, my favorite spots around town, even the small habits I'd never thought twice about. I read through one that described me leaving work late, another that mentioned a conversation I'd had with a friend at a cafe. I felt sick, the realization that someone had been watching me so closely filling me with a deep, gnawing fear. How had I been so oblivious? How could someone have been following me for so long without my noticing? I logged out, my mind reeling as I tried to process the years of surveillance I had just uncovered. But the fear remained, a constant pulse of dread that left me feeling as though I was still being watched. I thought I had seen the worst of it, but then I opened the last draft, the one dated that very day. My heart pounded as I read the message, the words blurring together as fear gripped me. "I miss our conversations. Don't ignore me." The tone was different from the others, no longer observational but intimate, familiar, almost pleading. Whoever was behind these drafts wasn't just a stranger. They felt like they knew me, as though we shared some twisted connection I had never agreed to. My hands trembled as I read the message again, feeling the weight of their words sink in. It wasn't just about watching anymore. It was about wanting to be noticed, a twisted form of attachment that made my skin crawl. The drafts weren't just surveillance. They were a call for attention, a claim to a relationship that I had no part in. I felt a chill as I realized that whoever this was, they felt entitled to my life, my presence. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls pressing tighter as the implications settled over me. I had thought this was just a disturbing invasion of privacy, but it was more than that. This person wasn't just a spectator. They wanted something from me, and the drafts were their way of getting my attention. I logged out of the account, my hands shaking as I quickly reset all my passwords, one by one. Every email, every social media account, anything that could possibly link me back to this person, I secured as tightly as I could. But even as I went through the motions, a creeping sense of futility washed over me. If they had been following me for years, there was no telling how deeply they had infiltrated my life. No way to know what other parts of my world they had quietly invaded. I deleted the old account entirely, hoping it would sever whatever connection had been created. But the unease remained, a dark presence that lingered in my thoughts. I went through my social media profiles, scrutinizing every post, every detail that might have given this person a way in. I scrolled through years of my own life, seeing it through their eyes, wondering how they had used these pieces to construct the twisted timeline I had just uncovered. No matter how many steps I took to secure my privacy, the sense of being watched stayed with me. a constant reminder that someone out there knew more about my life than I had ever willingly shared. I felt vulnerable, exposed, as though the safety of my own identity had been stripped away, leaving me open to an invisible threat. In the days that followed, the paranoia grew. Every time my phone buzzed, every time I checked my emails, I braced myself, half expecting to see another message, another intrusion into my life. The feeling of being watched hung over me like a shadow, following me everywhere. I started glancing over my shoulder, feeling eyes on me in crowded spaces, sensing a presence in every silent corner. I changed my routine, altering my routes, avoiding places I used to frequent, hoping it would throw off whoever might still be watching. But the fear remained. I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter where I went, no matter what I did, I was still being tracked. The drafts, the messages, they had dug into my mind, filling me with a sense of dread that I couldn't escape. I found myself avoiding interactions, avoiding anything that might let someone new into my life. My sense of trust had been eroded, replaced by a wary vigilance that kept me constantly on guard. The world had become a maze of hidden threats, each person a potential observer, each interaction a possible invasion. The highway stretched endlessly before me, a dark, quiet road bordered only by the faint outlines of trees and the occasional signpost, barely visible in my headlights' glow. The silence felt thick, broken only by the low hum of my car as I drove deeper into the night. I'd always enjoyed night drives. There was a certain peace in the solitude, in the feeling of being miles away from anyone or anything. As I drove, the familiar sense of calm settled over me, my mind drifting into the rhythm of the road. Then a glimmer caught my eye in the rearview mirror. A pair of headlights had appeared far behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. Just another car out on the highway, I assumed. Probably someone as eager as I was to escape the world for a while. I focused back on the road, not giving it a second thought. But something about those lights kept drawing my attention. They were distant, barely more than a glow, but they stayed there, steady and unwavering, no matter how many miles I drove. I told myself it was nothing, that they'd fade away soon. Yet as I glanced back again, a strange feeling began to creep in, like a quiet alarm sounding in the back of my mind. The miles ticked by, but the headlights remained, exactly the same distance behind me. I couldn't shake the growing sense of unease, that creeping feeling that something was wrong. The road was empty, desolate, stretching on with no other signs of life. It felt as though I was the only one out there, me and those headlights, steadily fixed behind me. I pressed my foot down on the gas, watching the speedometer climb. The hum of the engine grew louder, the road blurring slightly around the edges as my speed increased. I checked the mirror, half expecting to see the lights falling away. But they didn't move. They stayed exactly where they were, hovering in the distance like a ghostly pair of eyes, always watching, never getting closer or further away. A chill settled over me, a cold, prickling sensation at the back of my neck. I told myself it was just another car, that maybe the driver was simply matching my speed. But the consistency, the way those lights remained so precisely distant, felt wrong, unnatural. It was as though the lights were locked onto me, as though they were tethered to my car in some invisible, unbreakable way. I switched lanes, hoping to see the headlights move, hoping that whatever car was behind me would either pass or fall back. But as I shifted into the next lane, the lights moved with me, mirroring my position perfectly. My pulse quickened, a low thrum of anxiety beating beneath my skin. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, watched. I checked the mirror again and again, each glance confirming the same thing. The lights were fixed in place, perfectly centered in the rear view, as if they were meant to be there, as if they had chosen me. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was just a strange coincidence, maybe some trick of perspective. But the unease grew, fed by the persistent presence of those lights that refused to shift, refused to let me go. As I sped up again, the headlights stayed exactly in place, unwavering, like they were attached to my car by an unseen line. The highway stretched on endlessly, and with each mile my mind spun faster, grasping for some explanation, some reason for this strange, relentless pursuit. I pressed the gas harder, pushing my speed to the limit, the road blurring as I raced forward, the dark landscape slipping past in a dizzying haze. My heart pounded as I checked the mirror, desperate to see the lights fade or drop away. But they didn't move. No matter how fast I drove, how recklessly I navigated the empty highway, they remained perfectly positioned, as though they were bound to me. The fear that had been simmering beneath the surface began to boil over, filling me with a sense of helplessness I hadn't felt in years. What kind of car could keep up this way? What kind of driver would bother matching my every move so precisely? The lights felt less like headlights and more like a pair of unblinking eyes, watching my every move, locked onto me with a chilling determination. I tried to calm myself, to focus on the road ahead, but the constant presence of those lights in the mirror held my attention, a magnetic pull I couldn't ignore. No matter what I did, no matter how fast I drove or how many times I changed lanes, the lights stayed fixed, a silent reminder that I was not alone. I felt trapped, my mind racing as I tried every maneuver I could think of to shake the lights. I switched lanes, slowed down, sped up, but nothing worked. Each time I glanced in the mirror, the headlights were still there, always perfectly aligned with my car, like they were tethered to me, unable or unwilling to let me go. It was no longer about being followed. The lights had become an unbreakable hold, a silent force that refused to let me escape. My heart pounded as I clutched the wheel, my knuckles white as I veered from one lane to the next, weaving across the highway in a desperate attempt to lose them. But every time, the lights remained steady, unwavering. The fear that had been lurking in the back of my mind now engulfed me completely. I couldn't explain it, couldn't rationalize why those lights stayed so fixed, so constant. I had lost control of my own fear, now helpless in the face of whatever was behind me, holding me captive to its silent, relentless presence. Then in the distance, I saw a side road branching off from the highway, a narrow, unmarked path that I hadn't noticed before. Without a second thought, I swerved onto it, my tires screeching as I pulled off the main road. I watched the headlights in the mirror, half expecting them to follow me down this lonely, unpaved stretch. I pulled to a stop and killed the engine, gripping the steering wheel tightly as I watched, breath held, hoping, praying that the lights would simply pass by. But instead of speeding past, the headlights blinked out, vanishing into the darkness as if they had never been there at all. The road behind me was empty, a silent, endless stretch of darkness that seemed to swallow the space where the lights had been. There was no sound, no engine roaring by, nothing to suggest that there had ever been another car on the road. I sat there, frozen, staring into the darkness, waiting for the lights to reappear, but they didn't. All that was left was an empty, silent highway, and the heavy weight of fear pressing down on me. I sat in my car, stunned, the stillness around me almost suffocating. The silence felt unnatural, as if even the night itself were holding its breath. I strained to hear any hint of movement, any sound that would indicate I wasn't alone, but there was nothing. Only the empty stretch of road, the vast darkness, and the faint hum of my own fear. A part of me wanted to turn the car around, to drive back and see if the headlights would reappear, to somehow prove to myself that what I had seen was real. But the thought filled me with a dread I couldn't shake, a deep, instinctual fear that told me I was better off leaving it behind. Whatever had been following me, it was gone now, and I didn't want to give it a reason to come back. I turned the key, the engine sputtering to life, breaking the silence that had become so oppressive. I glanced in the mirror one last time, half expecting to see those lights reappear in the distance, but there was nothing, just the empty road, stretching endlessly into the night. I drove away slowly, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few moments, the fear lingering even as I put distance between myself and that dark, empty stretch. I couldn't shake the memory of those headlights, the way they had stayed fixed, steady, refusing to let me go until I'd finally pulled away. The highway had returned to silence, but the unease remained, a weight pressing down on my mind, refusing to lift. Working as a cemetery caretaker had always suited me. The quiet, the solitude, it was a peaceful life, and I'd come to know every inch of the grounds, every curve of the winding paths, every old headstone that stood as a silent testament to those buried beneath. I had my routines, my familiar rounds, each morning a comforting repetition of tending to the grounds, ensuring everything was in place. One morning, as I made my usual rounds, something caught my eye near an old, forgotten grave. The soil around it was damp, freshly turned, its loose, uneven texture an anomaly in the otherwise undisturbed earth. I approached, puzzled, crouching down to examine it. The grave had been filled decades ago, the headstone worn with time, its inscription barely legible, yet the soil around it looked as if it had been disturbed recently. I looked around, half expecting to see a misplaced shovel, perhaps some scattered tools left behind by mistake. But there was nothing, just the silence and that patch of unsettled soil. The chill in the morning air felt sharper as I stood there, unsure of what to make of it. I brushed it off as a fluke, perhaps the work of an animal or the result of a heavy rain. After all, I reasoned, it was just one grave. Nothing to worry about. The following morning I returned to the grounds, the fresh air filling my lungs as I moved from row to row. I almost forgot about the disturbed grave from the day before, dismissing it as a strange but isolated occurrence. But as I rounded a corner near another part of the cemetery, I froze. Another patch of fresh soil lay at my feet, loose and damp around yet another old grave, its surface upturned as if someone had been digging overnight. A flicker of unease began to settle in, a quiet question that whispered at the edge of my thoughts. Two graves, disturbed on consecutive nights, with no signs of tools or footprints, just freshly moved soil. I looked around, scanning the area for any sign of human presence, but the grounds were empty. The silence pressed down on me, making the air feel heavier. I tried to push the thought aside, to focus on my work, but the sight of that freshly turned soil lingered in my mind. A single disturbed grave was easy to dismiss, but now, with 2 in as many days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something strange was happening. I told myself I'd keep an eye on it, try to catch whatever, or whoever, was responsible. The next morning I walked the grounds with a sense of dread, bracing myself as I made my rounds. Sure enough, there it was, another grave, the soil newly disturbed, the ground damp and loose. Each day brought another grave, each one an old burial site, the headstones aged and cracked, their inscriptions barely visible. The same pattern repeated itself with each discovery. Fresh, damp soil, disturbed in the dead of night, yet without a single footprint or sign of tools. By now, the idea of an animal or the weather causing it seemed ridiculous. There was a precision to it, a consistency that felt too intentional to be anything natural. It was as though something was marking each grave, methodically moving from one to the next. The unease I'd felt in those first few days began to deepen, creeping through me like a shadow that wouldn't lift. I decided I needed answers. I would set up a camera near one of the disturbed graves, hoping to catch whoever, or whatever, was responsible for this strange ritual of nightly disturbances. That night, I set up a camera, positioning it carefully so that it would capture the grave from every angle. I checked it twice, making sure the battery was full, that everything was ready. As I left, a strange chill filled the air, the quiet pressing in as if the cemetery itself were watching, waiting. The next morning, I returned, my pulse quickening as I approached the grave. As expected, the soil was freshly disturbed, the earth loose and damp as it had been each morning before. I rushed to the camera, eager to review the footage, certain that I would find some answer, some explanation for what had been happening. But when I pressed play, the screen filled with static, white noise crackling and popping across the monitor. I scrubbed through the footage, my heart sinking as I watched hours of nothing but static, occasionally broken by a strange fog-like distortion that drifted in front of the lens, obscuring the view. It was as if the very air around the grave had conspired to hide whatever was happening there. The disappointment was crushing, but worse was the fear that crept in with it. Whatever was happening in the cemetery, it was beyond my understanding. And for the first time, I began to wonder if I was dealing with something that defied explanation. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something, that whatever was disturbing the graves was aware of my attempts to catch it on camera. The static, the fog that obscured the lens, it felt deliberate, as though something was actively hiding from me. Determined to put an end to the mystery, I decided to stay late, to watch over the grounds myself and finally put my unease to rest. The sun dipped below the horizon and the cemetery fell into darkness. I found a spot near the disturbed graves and settled in, the cold seeping into my bones as the minutes stretched into hours. The quiet was oppressive, the air thick and still. Every rustle of leaves, every faint sound made my heart race, my senses on high alert as I watched the graves. But nothing happened. The hours dragged on, the silence unbroken, and I began to feel foolish, wondering if I was letting my imagination get the best of me. Just as I was about to give up, a faint chill swept through the air, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling as a cold breeze seemed to brush past me. But when I looked around, the graves were still, untouched, the night as silent as it had been before. Frustrated and exhausted, I left, defeated by the unyielding mystery. Despite my vigil, the familiar sight awaited me the next morning. Another grave lay freshly disturbed, the soil damp and loose, marking yet another mysterious incident that had happened sometime during the night. I felt a strange, hollow dread settle over me, an understanding that this was beyond my control, beyond any logical explanation. I hadn't heard or seen anything the night before, yet something had been there, something had moved through the grounds, leaving its eerie signature behind. As I stared at the disturbed grave, a thought crept into my mind, one I hadn't considered before, that whatever was behind these disturbances wasn't a person, wasn't anything that could be explained by rational means. The graves, the loose soil, the static on the camera, all of it pointed to something beyond my understanding, something that defied the rules I had lived by all my life. A chill ran through me as I realized that I was dealing with forces that were beyond anything I'd ever encountered. Days passed, and the disturbances continued, each morning bringing another grave with fresh, damp soil, as if clawed from beneath. I stopped setting up the camera, stopped staying late. There was a part of me that no longer wanted to see what was happening, that felt it was better to leave the mystery alone, to accept that some things were best left unseen. I went through the motions each day, making my rounds as usual, but I avoided looking too closely at the disturbed graves. I began to feel like a guest in the cemetery, as if something else had taken ownership of the grounds, moving unseen beneath the surface. I didn't want to provoke whatever was responsible, didn't want to know what lay beneath the damp, disturbed earth. With each passing morning, I became resigned to the mystery, accepting that this was something beyond my reach. I focused on my tasks, keeping my eyes forward, ignoring the dark shapes in the corners of my vision, the strange chills that seemed to drift past me as I walked among the graves. Now, the disturbances have become a part of my routine, a strange, silent presence that I no longer question. Each morning, I make my rounds, nodding to the familiar headstones, my gaze carefully avoiding the patches of freshly turned soil that greet me with each new day. I don't look too closely, don't linger by the disturbed graves.